Good morning, hello, good afternoon, good evening. It's Frank Norris. I'm part of the Frank and Stan chat. And as you can see today, we have a guest. But first of all, let's introduce the other part of the partnership. Good morning, Stan.
Good morning. Early morning.
Yes, yes. And actually we're close, I think it's a couple of days for some schools. They've been back at school for a couple of days. So we'll get a bit onto that later. But we've got a guest this morning. Good morning, Henri.
Morning, lovely to speak to you. Thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining us. It's great to have you. I think you're probably our biggest celebrity we've had on Frank and Stan.
No pressure.
You flatter Frank, you flatter me.
Henri, can you just explain who you are and how we know each other?
So the Northern Powerhouse Partnership was set up over 3 years ago now to kind of shepherd a project which was started before that to try and rebalance the northern economy compared to London and the South East. We very much try and work with civic leaders and business leaders as well as others from across civil society to raise the issues that affect northern productivity and the lives of people who live in the north. And Frank has kindly been helping us out a lot over the last year and beyond, in fact, with much of our work actually on education and schools, which is an area that wasn't part of the Northern Powerhouse when George Osborne first gave a speech in the Power Hall over 5 years ago now. And we kind of launched the idea, but as our chair, he and the rest of our board very much now see the importance of schools. And there was a Northern Powerhouse schools review that was commissioned when he was in government, but we've very much gone, I think, a bit further than that in terms of thinking in a bit more depth about what really are the structural issues in education, not just actually in the north of England, but more widely the issues that affect white working class children wherever they live in the UK. We happen to have a lot of white working class girls and boys, not just boys.
Yes.
But actually they are particularly found in the West Midlands and in pockets across England and other parts of the UK. So understanding what's going on amongst that group, but also other ethnic and other social groups that do worse in education, I think is really important. And it has a big impact on places in the north of England where many of our schools struggle, partly because of the demographics and the economic situation of where they're located. And obviously we have a school accountability system that doesn't recognise that, Frank, but we might get onto that a little bit later because that is an issue of some between us.
Can you see, Stan, why we get on?
Frank's favourite topic.
I think
it's going to be dull as ditch water, I'm afraid. It's going to be a lot of people agreeing with each other.
I think the thing that the great enjoyment I've had of working with the Northern Powerhouse Partnership is that they have seen through this lie that actually teachers and school leaders in the north are not as good as those in the south. I think that for me, as soon as I started to understand that a little bit more, I then started to consider very carefully how was this accountability system playing out and whether it was really helping or not. And I think I've got to a position where I don't think it's helping at all in its current form, but no doubt we'll get onto that. So anyway, so we don't slag anybody off. We try and be positive. We understand this is a big issue. None of us here have had to lead an organisation. Well, Henri is now, but Stan and I have not had to lead an organisation through any sort of global pandemic or anything. So we are respectful of the challenges. Anyway, so what we normally do is start with, has anything caught your eye this week, Stan?
Well, for me this week, obviously it's been a week where schools are starting to go back, if they've not already gone back. And a conversation I've had with 2 head teachers and a couple of advisors who've already been in schools to say the children have come back brilliantly. They're following the rules, they understand them, the behaviour's been excellent, the staff have been really good, but parents have been really difficult.
Really?
Not following the rules, not seeing the need for the rules, not, crowding around the school gates, that kind of stuff, when their children are model pupils. In fact, one school in a particularly difficult area had said she felt like it was a grammar school. The children walked around where they should be, doing what they would. Very different. So the idea that behaviour was going to disintegrate, I think we can get rid of that myth now.
Yeah. So what about you, Henri?
So I've been The disadvantage gap, obviously, during the lockdown has been an area of a lot of interest to us and something we've been very concerned about. Rachel Reeves yesterday popped up BBC Breakfast with a very interesting idea that the government needs somebody to independently monitor what's happening to that disadvantage gap, which I think is a really interesting idea. She suggested Anne Longfield, the current Children's Commissioner. Sadly, she's only around till February, so she's not going to have long to get going if she is asked to do it. But I think it certainly highlights a really interesting idea about how we have more public awareness of what's really going on in schools. That makes sense. So as a parent, I obviously have a very limited picture of what goes on in the school that my child may happen to go to at any one time. I think public awareness of what's happening in the education system, particularly what's been happening in the last 2 years, and some of the kind of winners and losers from academisation has been very low. So I think that point about transparency, I'm not saying that necessarily everything that's happened has been wrong, but what I'm saying, I suppose, is that we don't have a lot of transparency about whether some of these reforms have worked. And I think if we're going to spend a lot of money on catch-up, which we are, I think it's only fair and proper that there's some evidence and some real-time understanding of what's going on, because otherwise a lot of the education world is based on learning from mistakes, right? But we don't necessarily have a lot at national level, certainly, of learning in progress. And the DFE needs to be more like the Department of Health has been during COVID, right? And thinking day to day about what they need to do to support education, rather than writing a check and then forgetting for 12 months and coming back later and going, oh, it was a nightmare. It was all someone else's fault. Because I just don't think that's really going to wash. And thank goodness all this focus on education, partly led by people like Bramwell Jeffries at the BBC, who I'd very much call out for making the national conversation move dramatically from where it was a few months ago, and rightly, that isn't going to wash anymore. And we should never have been in a position where that was considered good enough, that children's education was something that was kind of languishing as a policy issue rather than being what it should be, alongside the economy and health, the sort of one of the big three issues that's debated and talked about in the national media every day.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it was the thing that caught my eye, which links to that, is Lord Jim O'Neill's piece in the Yorkshire Post last week, I think it was last weekend, where basically he was calling out the DFE for being probably the least transparent, most, I didn't actually use the word dogma, it's a word that I've used a lot recently. I've got to be careful that I'm not putting words into other people's mouths, but a sense of that the DFE is so centrally governed, you know, that it wants control. And I think those of us who have worked in education for many years, that's just constraining all the time. And actually, the great promise of academisation, that it would actually loosen some of that hasn't materialised. So, you know, in effect, I think there's something seriously wrong with these sort of structures that we've got in some of the government departments that are preventing some sort of school leaders from doing the best that they can. So it's a similar sort of issue, I think, Henry. Okay, so what I think is useful is today, I think HS2 is going to, there are actually rail tracks being laid on the ground for the first time, so it's quite a big day. So I'm grateful for Henry having time to join us today. But as he said before, the Northern Powerhouse Partnership is much more than just railway lines. So in a sense, the work I've been doing with Northern Powerhouse Partnership has been around trying to shine a light on some of the disadvantage issues. But I'm particularly interested, Henry, in how we think that some of the most disadvantaged young people who are perhaps going to be leaving school next year or left school this year, what sort of world are they going to experience in terms of the workplace? I think we know there's not going to be many jobs around. And actually, I do worry whether or not they're actually equipped with a curriculum that's going to give them the skills that they require for the future. So I don't know whether or not you've got any thoughts on, you know, how we improve the skills gap going forward.
Well, I think what's really interesting, and people like Rob Halfron were saying this right at the kind of peak of the summer, right before the economic catastrophe was kind of fully kind of to be seen for everyone in its kind of full technicolor as it is today, and was talking very much about an apprenticeship guarantee, and some of those ideas have been taken up by the Prime Minister when we're in Rishi Sunak's budget. And you could argue, I suppose, that the Kickstart scheme, particularly for college leavers, for 18-year-olds, for those who may have finished their apprenticeships and haven't been offered a job at the end of it, might give that opportunity to avoid going into unemployment. Because clearly, the scarring effect of recessions is the big problem. So it's not just that young people might be on benefits for a while, and that's unpleasant and difficult, and I sympathise with anyone in that situation. But we know that if young people do that for a relatively long period of time, that their long-term prospects are absolutely finished. Does that make sense? If they miss out on experience of work for a long period in their youth, then they are very likely not to engage successfully with the workplace throughout their lives. So I think there's two challenges, right? There's the school leaver, the 16-year-old or the college leaver who maybe wants to go on to further study. And I think those people, that's a relatively easy public policy problem, because if people actually do have a case for more study, and even at graduate level, the Vice-Chancellor of Manchester University joined us last week with some other academics and the Labour front bench, and she was talking very much about kind of an upturn in PhD applications and master's applications, so postgraduate study. So this is happening throughout, and some of those children, people in Manchester, right, will come from some of those tougher states because they're very successful unit-winding participation. So my point is, throughout the educational journey, you will find young people from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, and often they're the ones that don't have the networks or the resilience to be able to succeed. And so the Kickstart scheme is part of the problem, but also the problem is the hotshot kind of kid who's come out of the council estate in Manchester from Moss Side who wanted to be a lawyer. That person's got a problem as well, right? So it isn't a simplistic issue. It's a further study issue for some people, and that might give them actually probably higher level skills than they otherwise would have got. So it may actually in some cases actually mean people take longer term better choices, right, than they otherwise would have done. But they're a relatively small group. But you've got to celebrate, in the spirit of this podcast, celebrate the positives. On the negative side, there's a lot more, and I think one of the areas we've been doing a lot of work on is there's Kickstart, right, for people who are just leaving college. That's probably the right answer for them, alongside incentivising employers to take up apprenticeships. Is the government doing quite enough in that space? You could argue.
It's a shame the Kickstart, isn't it? They've got to have 30 employees in the.
Yeah, I mean, us and others. If an SME rings me up tomorrow, Frank, and says I want a Kickstarter, then I'll go and find 29 others that want to do it. And I'm one of those people. Right? So I'd love to have a Kickstarter, but I mean,
I feel the same. I'm just a single employee. I mean, I have a little business myself. I'd love to have a young person come and join me for 6 months and work alongside me, but I can't do that unless I get 29 other people come and do it with me.
And I think we will do that, right? And certainly our metro mayors and our combined authorities are in a really good place then to better support those people. Because one of the challenges, right, is it's all very well giving people a job, but you've got to wrap around the employment and support. And actually the most vulnerable and the most hard to reaching people will naturally not engage with this programme, because if there's no support around it, then they won't be able to get the most out of it, and employers won't want to take them without the support that they'll need to make a success of it. So I think I think the gap is around, actually there's a big gap around graduate unemployment, and many of those young people who will have fallen out of the system. So the young person, for instance, at Sheffield, Hallam, going back to Barnsley or Doncaster, where they've lived with their parents. I tell you what, if you think the job market in London and the South East looks bad, try and get a job in Dongley right now. I mean, it's not an easy environment to be in. Now, there are jobs out there, but it's a challenging place to be. And if you don't have lots of parental kind of resilient wealth, bluntly, and no one can stand you some money to go and rent a flat somewhere else and look for a job there, I think there's a reality check about we need to create opportunities where those young people are, and not necessarily expect them to travel to them. And so we're certainly encouraging employers not just to engage with Kickstart, but to think about also those with higher level skills that might need a similar opportunity. And I think the government could do more in that space, and certainly will be advising them over the coming weeks with some suggestions about doing better.
Yeah. What do you think, Stan?
Well, it goes back to, I think, I was saying, I can never remember whether I said these online or said these in a general chat to you.
Don't worry. You often have to say them 2 or 3 times, Stan, for them to strike.
The method, the route by which disadvantaged children can actually, the social mobility needs to be planned. We do celebrate, and rightly so, the one child who comes from an area of poverty and everybody kind of relaxes and says, well, it must be okay then, because look, he or she's done it, therefore the system must be okay. And what we need to do is have a real roadmap to say, these are the support beacons that are needed. This is the finance that's needed. This is what schools need to be aiming at. These are the soft skills and hard skills that people want, and rethink what we're doing. Anytime, and I've not spoken to that many employers, but every time I have, they've talked about being able to work as a team, having the soft skills, being able, and none of that appears in the curriculum, none of it. And so we're testing, we're saying, here's all these exams they've done, geography, history, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but can they get on with a team? Well, actually, a lot of what's happening is pushing against teamwork and asking young people, children, to be individuals. Let's sit them in roles, let's not have group activity. What do you do as soon as you get a job? You work in a group.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true, Henry, of my conversations in the co-op. I mentioned this before, one of these, but actually, senior managers in the co-op go to some of the most challenging schools in the Co-op Academies Trust with some amazing young people who, for one reason or another, have not got the highest grades of the GCSE, and they marvel at their ability and wonder, and feel as though it's a little bit shameful that these young people are not able to make the next step towards on their career path because they didn't get a certain grade in a GCSE exam. But actually, the co-op can see other employers and can see the potential in these young people, want to grab them because, in effect, they need a little bit of support just to get them over a certain line, to get them established in a role. I do think, just while we're on it, is something in my head was, I know that we've had overgrading in GCSEs this year, or potentially. But actually, I think that's really good because we're going to find a lot of young people are going to get to college on courses they might actually want to do, but couldn't have done it before, for whatever reason. And I know that there's risk involved in that. I do think there are going to be a certain number of young people who are going to find themselves able to shine because they've actually managed to jump a step which they thought was too high for them. And I think that's a real, it'll be interesting to see how they develop, because I think that's part of that sort of a little bit of social engineering, is one way of describing it, and that we're able to give them the chance, whereas before we were preventing them from having the chance.
But should that barrier even be there, Frank?
Well, I know. Yeah.
Should it be that you have to get through this barrier that's not really appropriate to you, but I want to be going to media, yeah, but you've got to get maths and English first before you can do that. I'm a very creative artist, yeah, but we need to be able to do maths, English, and a science, and so. No, it's a barrier that at the moment for 16-year-olds I don't think is necessary. I really think a sort of a comprehensive school certificate of saying this is what this young person's strengths and areas for development are would be much more useful to an employer than 3 grades and an unclassified.
Yeah.
And I think, it comes back, doesn't it, to the kind of the debate about T levels, because I'm a great supporter of them, but they're pitched very high, and they are absolutely an equivalent to an A level. Well, the problem with that is, what do we do with young people that do not reach the required standard? And one of the things, right, is that the bricklaying qualification is really about turning you into a surveyor. So there's an argument really about, if you just want to be a bricklayer, if you don't want to be a foreman who gets to be a site manager by that route, is the qualification really geared at progression rather than the actual job? And I think that is one of the big challenges around our vocational system, is what are the opportunities to get young people who have not done well at GCSEs into high skilled jobs? Because this idea that there will always be a large number of lower skilled jobs where we can just churn young people at 16 and 18 who haven't managed to get an apprenticeship or get into another route, they're just not going to exist for much longer. And that's what COVID sort of shows you, that the employment that's gone, well, it's predominantly low skilled, and it's predominantly things that are very vulnerable to economic buffering and wins. And I think that's the challenge, is that how do we get young people into more resilient areas of the economy where they can have longer prospects? And certainly in the north of England, we want to increase productivity. Well, the biggest issue we have is not actually our school system, although we spend a lot of time talking about that and we're very passionate about it. It's actually, if you look at our 4 leading capabilities, digital, manufacturing, health and digital, which are going to drive our economy according to our independent review that we spend a lot of money and time doing, we're still behind in skill levels in all 4 of those areas compared to the England average. So even in the things that the North excels at, we're still behind the rest of the country. Now, some of that is to do with prior attainment. Some of that's to do with young people who can't, because we've got, so that's where education matters. It only matters to the extent that end stage examination focused qualifications prevent young people who could have made progress making progress to the next stage in the system. And the kind of this concept of robustness and kind of avoiding inflation, it's it's all based on an academic viewpoint, which is that the only point of every qualification prior to 18 is to decide what university you should go to, and that's government's obsession, bluntly. But I'm not interested really in what university young people in the North go to, because actually the evidence is that a number of working class kids do very well by going to university, and that's great. More of them should go, and we should help more of them go to top universities. But whether they go to Cambridge or Oxford and go to London, or whether they go to Manchester or Leeds and stay in the North, you can really argue that the economics of that either way you like.
Yes.
The really material problem for us is that from an economic standpoint is what happens to those young people that do not succeed as it's considered in the education system. And that lack of success is obviously chronically unfair in many cases, and in a lot of cases discriminatory based on the way in which the education system works. So it's unfair to them as individuals, but it's economically very damaging, because it means that we're missing out on a load of people. And I think the one great thing about the exam inflation, and it is inflation, but I don't have a problem with that actually, in the circumstances, because if you can't assess people properly, you've got to give them the benefit of the doubt, right? It's a bit like saying that 50% of defendants always have to be guilty, right? And then if someone's innocent, you just convict them anyway. I mean, the irony of this is that the fact that Ofqual ever thought that was going to work is just completely insane. So there's a fundamental point there that the lack of the difference between teacher assessment and exams is doubt. Well, you have to give someone without any knowledge to the contrary the benefit of it, right?
Yes.
Less people will read it, right? All those bleeding resits that we spend a fortune on preparing people for. Most of the adult skills budget in the UK is spent getting people in England, in particular, in northern cities, to resit their exams. And I'm like, you know what? When I think of an adult skills budget, getting kids to resit exams when probably it's not the best way of assessing whether they have functional English or maths anyway. Whether if they were doing an apprenticeship, they do a different qualification anyway. So it's like, well, why are we making these other young people who are basically doing similar career paths and progressions sit an exam that they've already failed once, twice, in some cases 3 times often? Yeah. Absolutely nuts, and spending a lot of public money doing it. I'm like, what are we doing? Like, why are we doing this? And those are the things we just need to stop wasting money on. I mean, at a very blunt level, let local areas decide whether they really care about that, and find different ways to get people the skills they need to get onto qualifications. Don't obsess with a numbered GCSE performance. But anyway, Stan, I talked across you, which
it's okay.
Your podcast is very rude.
I just say the same kind of thing. The grade inflation for me, that this great fear that we've got a year group, it makes no difference whatsoever, because it's just a stepping stone. And nobody in the whole of my career has compared whether my A-levels are the same as the year after or the year before. Because once you've done your A-levels and you go to university, nobody asks you about your A-levels.
No, I agree.
It's a pointless fuss about nothing. And it's because we judge, I mean, from the DFE, we judge schools and we judge colleges by those results. And it's their use of the data that's the problem, not individual pupils saying, I got a GCSE in 2020. Oh, well, 2020, oh, that doesn't really count. That's never going to happen.
And Matt, can I say, because believe it or not, that's 25 minutes, or probably more than that. Well, I'd love to have Henri back in a few months' time, if you could stomach this again. It's been a really interesting discussion.
I'm sorry we've gone on. I realised
No.
We talked about contextual data, Frank. So
no, well, let's see where we get to with that in a few months.
Maybe they'll need to wait till next week, eh?
Anyway, thank you very much, Henri, for joining us. Thank you everybody for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's been great fun, I have to say. If nobody watched it, I've enjoyed it. So thank you very much, and we'll hopefully see you all next week.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you both.